The transition of complex fleets in municipalities, logistics, utilities, and school bus fleets will be incredibly difficult without appropriate planning, optimization, and management tools. We talk about in this podcast how you can apply some of these tools to accelerate the decarbonisation of transport.
Your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Hello, Energy Leader. This is Chris Sass, host of the Insider's Guide to Energy, and I asked for just a few moments of your time to make you aware of a brand new program that I think you'll be excited about. The program is called Podcast Power, Media Training for Energy Leaders. You're probably already aware that podcasts are a dominant force in the media today. As an executive in the energy space, you are often asked to be a guest on a podcast, and your legacy media training leaves a lot of gaps in the skills you need to be successful on a podcast. Common sense doesn't always do it. And to avoid these pitfalls, Insider's Guide to Energy has partnered with the Antenna Group and their media trainers to create a hands-on interactive 2-day workshop designed for executives in the energy and clean tech space specifically. You'll get all the skills you need to have successful interviews and to reach the audience you intend to reach. So whether you're reaching out to customers, future employees, or investors, this is the class for you. Space is limited to the first 10, and those that are selected will get the opportunity to be a guest on the Insider's Guide to Energy, practicing your new skills. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Niall Riddell. Neil, what's going to happen today on this episode?
So today we're going to dive a little bit into how you plan, manage and optimize the transition to electric vehicles. So it's quite exciting that we've got Dan Hilson, who I met a number of years ago from EVenergi or BetterFleet, with us today to talk to us about that transition planning. Hey Dan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Dan Hilson. I'm CEO and founder of EVenergi and BetterFleet. And as Neil said, we're focused on the planning, optimization and management of zero-emission fleets. I've been in the industry about 20 years through clean tech, large and small companies, and really excited to be here. Thank you.
And we're going to dive into a number of different vehicle types, a number of different use cases, a number of different scenarios. But do you want to give us a real quick intro? How did this journey begin for you, and what is it that we're really trying to solve for today?
Yeah, I guess, ultimately I was very passionate about, clean tech, cleaning up the economy, working through lots of different areas of, microgrids and sustainable, decentralized energy solutions, and ended up really seeing that this was a big emergent problem. This was about, 10 years ago or so. And, really that nexus of energy and mobility wasn't being really well explored. So I really started to explore it as a sort of launched a business really around that nexus, and pretty quickly realized that fleets were where a lot of the exciting, traction was going to happen, but a lot of the really complicated problems. And obviously problems are always great for businesses to solve. So we went out about, trying to solve those problems, talking to hundreds of fleet managers and sustainability managers in multiple industries to, see where we could be, helpful in really accelerating that transition.
A nexus between energy and mobility seems to synthesize so many problems in the world today. Do you narrow that down slightly? Is there a specific user group you're going after, and what do you do to help them on that transition?
Yeah, look, as of today, we've really focused on complex fleets. So, transit, municipalities, utilities, logistics, school buses. These people have really complicated needs, mission critical duty cycles. They have to deliver. They're pretty overwhelmed by the journey. There are people who really haven't had the duty to electrify. The idea of chargers and, electrical infrastructure wasn't a thing for them. So really that kind of mission critical fleet is where we focus most of our attention, as opposed to say, an office wants to install a couple of chargers at the front. That's not really our segment. It's really people who have those kind of really complex use cases.
And within those sort of complex fleets, I can imagine you've got everything from street sweeper through to refuse collection, through to bus, through to truck, light van, car. You've got a little bit of everything. Is there a common thread that runs through this journey? What is it that unites that group of complex fleets?
Yeah, look, generally it's about, electrification of depots at scale. So these sort of fleets generally have, a large scale depot. They have dispatch and parking and people coming and going, and someone needs a vehicle available at a particular time, not like whenever. Often it's, complex in terms of load management and, how you're going to actually, distribute the load between those vehicles, not just I plug in and I get an equal share, but how does that all work? So yeah, there's real similarities there. And really across that group, you've also got professional fleet managers, people whose job it is to deliver a customer service, right? A customer outcome to their drivers, and to the public. You've got the transit delivering day to day, people to do their job. They run the economy in many ways. You've got people who are picking up the garbage or sweeping the streets. If they don't do what they do that day, things are really impacted. As opposed to often obviously people driving to work's important, but you're not going to have civil unrest if someone doesn't get to work one day.
So this means that you've got like this blend between the energy transition. They're moving from a liquid fuel to an electric fuel. You've got some municipalities who are conventionally quite slow, but also being driven quite hard by regulation, mixed with emerging technology, change management, that whole equation. What do you do for the customer? How do you help them with that? What is basically sounds like a bit of a mess for a big business or a big complex business.
Yeah, maybe I can use some case studies, I guess. I mean, if you think about, we were from Australia originally. I mean, we've expanded to Europe and to North America. But, in Australia, our largest initial client was probably, the ACT government was the first. They moved very early, but then Transport for New South Wales. So from the point in time that a minister stands up and says, hey, by 2030, everything's going to be electric or hydrogen or whatever they decide, that sort of flows down into, as you mentioned, like all the people who actually have to activate, and we often say, like, we try to meet in the middle between that sustainability aspiration and the operational reality. So for us, it's all about, okay, let's get a really clear operational reality. Our digital twin technology, our planning software is essentially used to create that shared understanding. We have like an asset management module that says, what assets have you got? When are they going to transition? When's their useful life going to be over? And is there a vehicle that will be available to replace that particular asset at that time? And our digital twin says, well, here's a geography, here's the climate, here's regenerative braking, here's everything to do with the physics of the vehicle, the physics of charging. Will their vehicle be able to do that task, or how do you optimize that? So really it's about baselining what's there, looking at the emerging technologies, being able to scenario plan. Like all our software is really in the planning side about scenario planning. Like what are your alternatives and what happens economically, operationally, from a sustainability perspective if you mix and match those alternatives? What's the right mix for you?
How often do you find that you can't help someone get electrified today? How many fleets are ready? I mean, I think when we talked initially, perhaps let's say a trash fleet in New York City, that they have multiple roles. They pick up trash, they plow snow, or something of that nature. Are those fleets ready? Are there vehicles already in pipeline to handle that kind of utilitarian use?
Yeah, look, I mean, people like us navigate the market through who's ready. And so Transit's been a huge player in people where the vehicles are available, the government incentives are there, the willingness is there. It's just a beautiful use case for public transport's fantastic anyway. You electrify public transport, you have so many users who inhale diesel fumes, school buses are the same. It's just a great end-to-end story. So a lot of focus has been there. But then, and also with those, like when we worked with the Welsh government, it was really tough. They've got difficult topography. They were looking at hydrogen versus electric. So in some of those use cases, it's a toss-up, but you do get them to work. As you mentioned, there's some where it's snowing. For example, you've got snow plowing on the same vehicles that do trash. And the duty cycles just won't get there in the snow. It's too heavy. The degradation of the battery. The state of charge of the battery degrades too quickly, and you need to look at changing that fleet. I mean, if you believe that we need to transform as an economy, then we also need to look at the fleet and how it's working. And with newer technologies like autonomous vehicles, or a lot of these other technologies that are emerging, like can you restructure that fleet? I'm a firm believer that you have to transform because we have to get there from an environmental perspective.
So I'm going to grab a chance to talk about the Welsh, because I like to talk about the Welsh. But even more interestingly, you inferred there was a debate between electric and hydrogen, and clearly there is a lot of discussion around where both of these technologies play in the transport ecosystem. Can you tell us a bit more about that experience of reviewing and assessing the complexities of moving between either an electrified system or a hydrogen-based system?
Yeah, look, I mean, because we have a planning tool, I mean, we do have a charge management system, so we do both, and we want to develop something for hydrogen in the future. We are agnostic when we go in and we do our planning for a fleet. We just want to get the best outcome, and so for the Welsh and for lots of others, South Australian government, there was some preconceived ideas about possible kind of solutions, and but it is a very complicated debate. I mean, there's obviously the vehicles, there's the cost of the vehicles, there's the efficiency of the actual, productivity of converting that fuel into, propulsion is a big sort of question. And obviously hydrogen has a lot of challenges in that area in terms of converting it from one to the other. But then you also have the supply chain. And I think the supply chain is one of the biggest, not just to get it there. Like, lots of people think of supply chain and they're like, how do we get it into the Welsh fleet from somewhere? But there's a biggest issue for me is like, what's the better use of that green hydrogen? Because there's not a lot of it, but there's a lot of demand. So you've got shipping, you've got air, you've got air transportation, you've got all sorts of different competing demands, including putting it into the grid. And so for me, the challenge with transport, when we've really looked at it end to end for a government, for a nation, what have you, is that the best use? And I struggle personally to see that as the best use, which really means that the competition for that will push the prices up beyond what can be afforded, because a shipping line might have a 20-year contract taking all that hydrogen. It just won't leave a lot. So that's kind of a big challenge that I see.
And within that hydrogen debate, you mentioned briefly green hydrogen. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between green, blue, brown, grey, other types of hydrogen, so we can put that in context of what it means?
Yeah, it just really comes down to the how are you generating that hydrogen, and so how green is it really? Like, what is the content from an emissions perspective? Particularly sort of scope 2 emissions into that hydrogen.
We jumped right into the conversation and we've gone into the detail. So help me understand better what it is you do when you engage with let's say, a municipality, or when I want to electrify my school buses or whatever. How's the engagement work? And where do you come in at what point?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've got two channels to market. So on the one hand, we have a charge management and planning software that a channel can buy. So if you're ABB, or if you're a electrical installer, you might just install our charge management software, and we don't really directly engage. And we've got people like AECOM and lots of channel partners globally that use our software. So that's sort of the one, which is we support people who service a customer. We have a solutions group that will go in and actually directly service a customer in some cases. And we have some very large customers like, King County Metro or Toronto Transit, or, some of these others that, they need that additional support. And so in that case, we will actually go in and, we can do everything from the start of the journey. We can go in and do fleet engagement and consulting, help them to set up for the transition. We can use our software, but also support them through, hey, how do I procure a vehicle, and what's the upcoming technology? And we publish reports and we help them navigate that space. Help them with things like fleet productivity. A lot of the missing piece here is, do you have the right fleet? So if they go into this transition with the idea that they're just going to electrify their existing fleet, but actually they've got 50 vehicles too many, that's a really poor starting point, because you're actually electrifying or decarbonizing the wrong thing. So we have sort of a team of automotive experts and sustainability consultants, and they really help us to do two things. One is to provide that solution end to end, and the other is to inform our product development. So it's great to be engaging with customers to understand their needs firsthand, to feed into our product, so we know we're developing things that are really addressing pain points of the customers.
And as you therefore gather data, gather insight, you must be able to start to build your digital twins you described. But with these really complex, multivariate problems, how do you decide what to optimize for? Is it a story of optimizing for carbon, a story of optimizing for cost? What are the drivers that you're really trying to optimize and solve for?
Look, it's really up to the client. So if you've got someone who says, our our mayor is so keen to transition, it just doesn't matter what the cost is. Or someone saying, look, we've got a grant from the FTA in America, like really, like we've got the money. It's not the question of cost. That's one optimization. If you've got someone as an operator in London, like your clients like Go Ahead of ours or others, and they're saying, look, we have to compete for this. We just have to figure out how to do this in the most cost efficient way, then that's a different optimization. So for us, it's really working with a client, and we can tweak our engine to say, hey, look, are we optimizing here for carbon or cost, or even operational efficiency? I mean, in general, operational efficiency is generally number one, right? If you can't deliver passengers to the city of London, you're not gonna win any battles as the mayor, right? So if it gets stuck on that, then it'll usually, I mean, what do they say? The mayor of New York, is hired and fired on plowing the snow. Like it's that kind of problem statement. So there's these really hard lines about operational efficiency. That's the bottom line, and then on top of that, you optimize for carbon, for cost, for vehicle availability. Right? Again, there's some hard constraints. Like if there's just not a vehicle available, and I'll stop there. You probably got other questions. Sorry.
Well, I hear the constraints, and one that you haven't mentioned is the utility or the capacity. So is that generally not something that's coming up in your day-to-day? I mean, you mentioned a bunch of them, but that has yet to come up in the free conversation we've had so far.
Oh, look, that's a massive one. Sorry, if I haven't stated it, it's not because it was just because I didn't get to it. It's an enormous one. Like in America at the moment, getting sites power is absolutely a constraint to accelerating the transition. It's a huge constraint. It's a problem people are working on all the time, to the degree of like at some point people will move depots towards power. It's that much of a constraint that you'll actually have a shift in how we organize our actual transportation industry if in areas where it's that much of a driver to decarbonize, like where they're saying, look, we have to decarbonize, we need to do it by this date, like California, for example. They will start to be a reshuffling of some of these elements. So yeah, we do a lot of load management in our products, both in planning and in optimization. And we have examples where a government's gone to a private operator and said, hey, you need to put 10 vehicles on that site, and it could only fit 3. So we had to plan, and now we're managing effectively 10 vehicles on 3 chargers. It's that sort of dynamic, the things we need to do with charge management to solve for that problem. So it's a huge part of what we do in terms of both load modeling, load management. There's some really interesting strategies like dynamic envelopes where utilities are saying, hey, if you can manage load in particular times and commit to that, we'll give you a break in the upgrade up front. There's all sorts of things that we're involved with that are trying to solve for that enormous problem. Have you come across,
I know when we worked in New York, there was a company that had these basically trucks that were batteries that they would go to depots. They were designed for fleets. Is that a solution that you're seeing in the wild? That are people bringing in fleet-sized batteries to do charging? Like I said, I know we've interviewed them on the podcast, but are you seeing it in your day-to-day planning?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have mobile units in a lot of transit, whether it's for disaster recovery. I mean, look, a couple of those chargers stop working. You have to have. So it's being used in the wild, absolutely. I think one of the themes that I would generally talk about and think is very important is not to have point solutions, not to go, oh, well, this works once, so let's do it. We need to have solutions that are, hey, for waste removal, this is the solution. You're going to need 2 of these that come in, if there's a problem with the charger, come on route. But there is that transition where you have a yard and you say, look, for a year, we need a mobile storage unit, or we need to put a massive generator on site, which is not great for the environment, but it will carry us through the next couple of years to get decarbonized. So there is this sort of balance between, hey, this is the solution, but we need some standard solutions for that 2-year period where we're bridging to grid availability. And there's loads of that happening in the States right now. Big projects that are having bridging solutions for a couple of years, with large-scale battery storage, and which is movable. They'll use that for 2 years, move it to another site where they're then going to, use it again.
And is the regulation staying in touch with that, with those bridging solutions? Are they allowing for those kind of solutions? Can I put a huge diesel generator in with my electric fleet of school buses if that's what I need? Is the regulation going to allow me to do that?
Well, obviously regulation is very different and not uniform globally. I think, intelligent regulation would see that as a decarbonisation overall. What's the impact against business as usual? So again, like what's the baseline, and then what are we doing here, and how does that help? There's no question that there's no government that would cut a ribbon with a diesel generator sitting out the back, right? That's not a good outcome. But at the same time, practically speaking, as a person who cares about decarbonisation, if that is an important bridge that will get you there, and you can show over 20 years there's like a 90% reduction in CO2, then that's a good outcome.
So I've heard this theory that you briefly mentioned there about moving your actual depot, your actual physical location to where the power is before. And I've heard it often presented as a theory. Have you actually seen that in, practical real life, or is that something that is perhaps just hypothesis at this stage?
Look, there's a lot of shared fleet charging infrastructure concepts emerging, and so they are being built. And it's really a case of industry or government saying, let's just put, a big charging depot here. And we think there's going to be a lot of fleet demand for it. So it's more happening in the context of semi-private public charging. So what would have been called a big public charging station being now positioned as a fleet shared charging infrastructure station. So that's definitely happening. When we've done big studies like for whole of government transit systems around the world, you do look at it and you go, well, are these depots positioned in the right place? We've done studies, for example, for investment banks who are looking at approaching governments and saying, hey, look, your depots are in the wrong space. We're going to buy a bunch of land, put them in the right space, and that's really happening in lots of countries. So there is this sort of meeting of large-scale master planning, and we do a lot of master planning. We have a product called GridFleet that does master planning itself, where we can say, like, where should infrastructure go, meeting again with the operational reality of, hey, we can't move that depot because it's just been there for 50 years. It's got too much other infrastructure. So, you're kind of balancing those things.
We in the UK are classic Brits. We grumble about a few things. One of the things we grumble about is not having an institutional strategy. Do you see quite a big variation between the continents that you're operating on in terms of the strategy that's being deployed, the speed at which the various municipalities are addressing the challenges, or do you see it fairly consistent?
I think it's much more localized and regional. So if you think about London buses, there's strategy there. They've got targets. They're moving towards it. They're collaborating with operators. The operators, other people might grumble, everyone grumbles in the UK, but as you say, but there is, and the Welsh government, as I said, strategy. Scotland, I'd argue, has strategy. Ireland, so this levels and pockets of cities. California has a strategy, which other states are following that are kind of believe in that strategy. They've got regulation in place. They've really kind of, and again, a lot of this is about how holistic they are. Have they thought about the planning all the way through the implementation? Is their incentive regime supportive of the sorts of things and creating the right behaviours? Is it short-term or long-term? So I'd say there are strategies in place around the world. Australia has a strategy which is really, really integrated. New South Wales government, big sort of client and, fantastic leader in the market. They've got a good, strong strategy. ACT government, years ago, 2017, they launched a strategy before almost anyone. So, it's really pockets, and it would be great to have national strategies. Sometimes they exist, sometimes they don't.
So we're seeing pockets of regional differentiation, regional growth, regional, leadership. Do you see the same thing within the vehicle classes, or perhaps even the use types of vehicle classes? So do you see buses as being significantly ahead of refuse trucks, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. There's transit is definitely moving fast. Municipalities have strong mandates, and they're just trying to find vehicles often. And they have big passenger fleets, right? And we help them with those passenger fleets that still have, their own challenges around load management and other things. So, and obviously there's commercial delivery fleets, last mile deliveries moving quickly. The UK, there's very strong mandates. Tesco is a global leader in many ways in that segment. Amazon wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't economic. they have such scale. They've almost purchased I wouldn't say purchased, but they're a huge investor in Rivian, right? And they're getting it to happen through brute force of like having that interest and understanding it deeply. So that's moving very quickly. There's a lot of markets that are behind and trying to move. But drayage in the US, for example, there's really strong policy incentive on drayage in the US. It's hugely polluting. It's very concentrated in disadvantaged areas. So again, there's these pockets of let's move it forward. And the policy does precede the manufacturer saying, hey, lots of incentives, good structure, some carrots, some sticks, let's go and build some vehicles. So there's part of it's the vehicles, and then there's part of it is the actual, structure of the incentives that drive vehicle delivery.
How much nuance is there to these vehicles? I mean, if you're talking a drayage, you're talking just very short, maybe around, Port of Long Beach or something like that. You're not driving cross country. For planning purposes, how much institutional knowledge does your team need, or when you're building these models up? Because I'd imagine that's very different than a bus fleet or fire engines or some other fleet.
Yeah, it was interesting because years ago, I remember I had this hypothesis that there'd be all these startups in China and around the world that would be like, hey, I'm just going to do the fire engine and I'm just going to do the, and that they'd explode just doing that one use case and doing it really well end to end. It seemed to make sense. It hasn't really played out so far. And you find a lot of the big guys are moving from use case to use case. And I'd say the way to look at it is it's a system, right? Like the difference between having somewhere you can fuel on the road and having chargers, potentially with some on-route charging, much more complicated dispatch, and a mobile battery that has to integrate into the grid, that's a system. And so when you look at what's going to happen with refuse and waste, people will work out that system and they'll present the best option for that system. And they'll say, right, this is how this should work end to end. Maybe it's like 4 hydrogen vehicles and 20 electric, and here's how you do the dispenser, and here's how you do the electric. And that's what gives you the coverage from a disaster recovery perspective. And hey, you need a battery. And so from my perspective, the people that figure that system out end to end, and it is different for different use cases, but again, like mission critical will need resilience. And so there'll be similar systems for a police fleet or a fire fleet. There'll be systems that emerge. So, I do think there's a combination of similarities, but then needing that end to end systems thinking to how to make those different use cases work.
And to build up that view on the system, clearly you need quite a lot of data. What are your kind of go-to data sources? Is it all based around telematics? Are you basing it around historical fuel purchases? What's the thing you use to start understanding the transition and really put numbers behind the thesis?
Yeah, so one of the there's some baseline things that exist like topography, and that exists in lots of forms. So what is the kind of spatial landscape, whether that's through Google APIs or other things, that's accessible in lots of different ways. Then you've got climate, which is sort of a build on top of that. And then you've got the grid, like where's the grid? And then you've got where's on-road infrastructure. So our models kind of build in all of these layers. And then obviously you've got the physics of the vehicles, the physics of the chargers, which manufacturers provide. If you have, like we're starting to get more color on the actual data from our charge management system and where we can use it. We can't always, they're private operators, but we've got a transit system that's willing to share it. We can get some color in terms of the vehicle actual behaviors. So it's a sort of a combination of the digital twin emulating things, whether that's emulating the charger or the vehicle, or the battery degradation. There's lots of physics models that can show how battery will degrade, or air conditioning systems, which is a huge thing, a huge impact on the ability for something to meet a range. What is the actual efficiency based on the climate and the air conditioner? It's partially passenger loading is a big one. All of these things impact. So we have these models which take the physics of these things and then basically apply the real data. And the exciting part is now the real data is becoming available. We're seeing what actually happens. That's a whole other conversation. What is actually happening is really interesting.
Therefore, you end up with a model for a single site and a single piece of the transition. How do you start looking beyond one depot to maybe enable people to, local authorities often have one or two depots. How do they, model the second depot or enable another party like the fire, the police to visit one depot and share those assets? Is that something that goes into your thinking as you build out that system?
Yeah, so we've sort of got we've actually got three views on it. So we've got grid fleet, which is a whole of network view, and that can be used by utilities or governments to think about where all those depots are. And then we've got BetterFleet, which is our core product and actually how we brand in the US. And essentially that product is essentially looking at, at the depot view and the depot modeling, but also like we can combine those. So we can look across depots. And for planning, for example, we can say, hey, that bus fleet's also going to charge on rail. Like, what does that do to the need in the depot? So we can sort of extrapolate those different layers. And, we have clients that have 1,000 depots, like New South Wales government. We can do a much more high-level view of what happens if all those assets transition. I mean, I'll give you a good example of that. So taking, Department of Education, taking their telematics data and looking at, okay, well, where do you need to charge? Where are all the schools? Where can you opportunistically charge? And then what's the cost difference if you did that opportunistically rather than try to do it all overnight? And I mean, in some cases, we've saved 10 or $12 million in figuring out how to opportunistically charge rather than loading up depots and increasing the infrastructure on all these individual depots. So it's a very important question and opportunity for efficiency.
And with that follows the fact that you've now got a data set which could almost dictate at a societal level where we need to build infrastructure. So you're almost doing you described it, you're doing system level planning to enable entire municipalities, towns, regions to look at their electrification strategy. This is super exciting because we need to move big chunks towards that direction of travel. What would be your single biggest case study of work you've done so far, and how are you starting to see the results of your analysis come to life?
Yeah, so we started that out working with utilities in Australia, like Ausgrid and some of the large utilities. And then eventually we got appointed to do what's called national map. So for the federal government, actually we did it for New South Wales government first, and then that was adopted as a national standard in Australia. So we actually mapped the whole of Australia by traffic volumes, heavy vehicle flows, topography, adoption, like what were the adoption curves, and really sort of did hotspots, like where would these charging infrastructures need to be, which is kind of top down, right? So it's never going to be perfect, but we then did that for Michigan and we've done that in Wales. And so we've started to take that methodology elsewhere. But then now what we're getting to is the bottom up build of that. So like, okay, we've done that high level. Now we're actually getting, particularly from fleets, some real data about where they are and what they're doing. And there's some initiatives we're launching now about how do we combine that top down view, which does have some real data. It's not like it's all extrapolated, but with now bottom up view of things really happening, we know where things are happening. How do we basically look at that? Yeah, and we do have a temporal view of that as well in terms of, if you go to New South Wales Master Plan and Google that, it'll show you like we work out as adoption happens, as batteries get better, as range gets better, like what does that look like into the future in terms of the needs? And it really does change over time as well.
How dramatic is that change going to be? If you're buying assets like these trucks, or if you're doing heavy equipment, those are long-term assets, right? They're not like maybe a van fleet or a car fleet. I'd imagine you change more often than some of these heavy assets. So how hard is that to have a crystal ball and predict for the business owner?
Yeah, it is. It's super difficult. I mean, you need to be able to, on the one hand, not time the technology. That's what grants and incentives are for, right? Like grants and incentives are trying to close the total cost of ownership gap and protect you a bit if you're a first mover from these challenges. So the reason why the FTA is funding huge amounts for bus operators right now is because they know some people are going to make mistakes, but they've fundamentally funded the whole thing. So you've got to be a bit careful, but at the same time, it is difficult. But there's sort of bets you can make. Like if a vehicle works for your use case today and is cost effective, that's okay. That's going to work. Even if a vehicle 2 years down the track comes along and can do that a lot better, and the range is better and the battery will survive longer, that vehicle will still have resale value to some mum and dad who wants to buy a passenger vehicle in the future. And, and basically it's a good total cost of ownership asset for them. So, some of these bets are able to be made today, but, you do need to plan. And that's why we have this multi-year asset planning philosophy, which is maybe you do delay a year in some cases. That's okay. Maybe you accelerate because the vehicle costs have come down. So you need that. And one of the things why software is important to complement consulting is because you need to be able to do that replanning cost effectively. If you have to get consultants in alone every year, that becomes prohibitively expensive. It needs to be done in an automated way. So the next year you just press a button and you say, right, well, I've sold some vehicles, I've bought some, what's the new technologies? Give me a look at what I should do now. So that's sort of also why I'm a true believer in automation here. It needs to be an automated planning process that can recast every year.
Well, going that way, you talked a bit earlier about digital twin technology. And are you using digital twins quite a bit to do that? So you have a virtual example of a metro situation that you're working with. And is that how you're coming up with the recommendations then?
Yeah, so essentially, it depends on how long we're engaged. I mean, hopefully we sell people a license for multiple years, which we do in many cases. So in that case, once we have the digital twin engaged, and essentially that'll map their network, in that industry, there's a thing called GTFS, which is a standard file. Unfortunately, in the UK, it's called Trans Exchange, slightly different, but kind of roughly model on the same concept, which is really about scheduling, starts, stops, where things need to go. But then they'll also have scheduling systems like Hastus or Optibus, where they'll give richer information about that. So once we have that all mapped into our system, to update it for vehicle types or, hey, I bought this vehicle or another vehicle is very quick. So it's really about mapping that the first time and then being able to rerun a scenario, the next year or the year after. That's quite a quick exercise. So it's so important. And it hasn't been done that way. People do get a consultant, they get a report, stick it on a shelf. Next year, they're like, well, hang on, what happens? A business just, this particular technology is unviable now, or this is not happening, or Proterra goes out of business. These things happen, right? And so they have to replan. And so, our hope is it'll move more and more towards automation.
I spent about 5 years forecasting the energy market, and the one thing I can consistently say is I usually got it wrong. The problem with forecasting and scenario planning is it's really challenging. Do you tend to forecast a bracket, like a range, under these scenarios, these drivers you're high, under these you're low, and therefore what are the 2 or 3 really big drivers you look at? Is it battery technology? Is it economics and oil price? What do you see dictating those sort of upper and lower brackets in the scenarios?
Look, I'd say one thing, which is model the worst case. Start there, because if you model the worst case, you can kind of then look at, okay, great, everything will work in that worst case, then you can build from there. So we model that as a baseline, but then you're absolutely right. Like, sensitivity analysis is critical. So we will run out, for example, we did the modeling of the whole of Bristol, and we went and spoke to the mayor and all the stakeholders, and we said, look, depending on prices, depending on all these things, this is what's going to happen. And you can make a decision. You can either take the worst, take the best, or somewhere in between, and then you can make decisions. But absolutely, forecasting needs to be a assumption-driven. The assumptions have to be visible and honest, and then you can do scenario planning.
Dan, this is incredible. You've taken us on a journey that clearly indicates you are moving us towards a world where we are creating scenarios of the future right before our very eyes. So delighted to have had you on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to watching some of those scenarios come to life.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been a really engaging conversation.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Insider's Guide to Energy EV. If you have questions, statements, or thoughts about the content today, just make comments. Go to the YouTube channel, add comments, add them wherever you get your podcasts, add them on our LinkedIn group. But make the comment and you'll get an answer. We look forward to talking to you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy EV. Bye for now.